Welcome to this introductory course on Rwandan law. In this video, we'll talk about the legal system in Rwanda. Whether you're a citizen of Rwanda, a foreign resident, or if you're thinking about moving to Rwanda or just want to understand how the legal system works for an investment that you're making or as part of a broader research project that you're working on, this video hopes to be a easy to grasp and accessible introduction into the legal system in Rwanda. Welcome to Rwanda Law 101. In this course, we're going to cover sources of law, the legislative system, the various ministries under the executive branch of government, applications of law and implementation, and a bit more. This is meant to be a concise view of Rwanda law, primarily focused on foreigners who have no idea with how the Rwandan legal system works, but also for people living within Rwanda who might be curious about some of the changes. If you haven't kept up to date, there are a lot of things that have changed over the years, and so we'll be talking a little bit about that as well. So Rwanda has actually a hybrid legal system. Whereas in the US or UK, you have common law, where cases can determine the interpretation of law and be leveraged. Rwanda has a hybrid. So that is civil law, or rather statutory law, customary law, and common law. Over the recent few years, there has been a transition more into common law, as you might be familiar with US and European systems, or certain European systems. If you're not familiar with customary law is based on customs. It's based on kind of how things have been traditionally. It's very much culturally derived, and it can bubble up from the very local village or town level and up into even the national arena. And then there's civil law, which is the primary source of law, and that is based on laws passed by Parliament and the Constitution, as well as some of the mandates, which we'll go over. Let's take a brief look at what we'll be covering. So we'll be first talking about the sources of law in Rwanda, which is always the first place to start. Then we'll be going into freedom of association and freedom of speech, so political parties and what people are allowed to say. Then we'll go over into freedom of movement of both goods and people. And this was actually inspired from a book I recently picked up on EU law, and I thought it would be relevant to kind of go over, given that Rwanda is a member of the Africa Free Trade Area, as well as the East African Community. Additionally, we'll talk about law enforcement and criminal law. Then we'll head over into civil law, and we'll focus on contract, commercial, and property law, as that's most relevant to Rwanda Land and Infrastructure Development Association. Then we'll pop over into the appellate court system, and we'll look at Supreme Court decisions that have been arrived at in recent years, and we'll talk about the cases that happened in the primary courts that led up to those. And this will just provide a little bit of color on the interpretation of laws and on how all that works. So let's get started. So this is an abridged map of the Rwandan government and legal system. So the primary source at the top is the Rwandan Constitution. From there, we have international treaties, which are ratified into law by the national executive. Any international treaty that is agreed on in Parliament must be ratified by the president for it to come into force in Rwanda. That's why the arrow is pointing upward from the national executive to international treaties. From there, we have three branches of government. We have the legislative branch, which is represented by the Parliament. The Parliament is made up of two houses. One, the lower house, is the Chamber of Deputies. And the interesting thing about the Chamber of Deputies is that there's actually an allocation or rather a quota for women, people of disabilities, and young people to represent the population. Additionally, there is a second house called the Senate, which is a mix of elected officials and people who are appointed, and they are the ones who put laws into force that arrive from the lower house. We'll get a little bit more into that. As you can see here, the color codes for bodies are in gray, and the actual, as you can see, regulations, orders, laws, acts
decisions, etc., are all in that orangish red. And so then we have the national executive, and the national executive starts with the head, which is the president, and that branch can issue decrees and regulations. And there are also ministries, so environmental ministries, other types of ministries within the national executive branch that issue ministerial orders. And we'll go over some of those because some of those are very relevant. They interpret a lot of the law. And then far over here on the right side, we have the judiciary system. And that starts from primary courts, where cases are heard, both criminal and civil cases. And you can appeal to a higher court, and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so those decisions, while moving to common law, those decisions are not necessarily laws in the sense that case laws are seen in other Western systems. Again, that is changing a bit, but they do act and have historically acted in a way of interpreting what laws mean. And the judiciary also is charged with ensuring that legislative acts do not violate the Constitution or other higher. So this goes kind of from the top into the bottom. And then we have customary laws. And these, again, kind of originate more at the local government, citywide level. But they can trickle all the way up to turning into statutes. And so customary laws are observed by the judiciary, but they kind of span across the three branches of government, which is why there's that span there. And then there's the local governments, and then they have their local bylaws, but those are subordinate to, obviously, the legislative acts, the ministerial orders, and that's why it's at the bottom. These don't usually have any conflict, but in the event that they do, the judiciary will look at kind of the pecking order that we see here. And again, there's a notification at the bottom. This has been greatly oversimplified, and some of this has been put here just for ease of grasping the information. So please don't take this in a literal sense. This is just meant to show that there's a lot more arrows that could be here, but to provide a very simple way of looking at it, this is, I think, one of the ways that you could look at this. So you don't have to take my word for any of this. You can go to amatekeko.gov.rw, and you can actually look up these laws and legal reports as well as judgments. It's a really great site, very user-friendly. The search works incredibly well. You can filter by Supreme Court or whatever you're looking for. So I highly recommend taking a look at this if you're doing business in Rwanda, or if you live in Rwanda and you want to just understand the laws a little bit better. So when talking about legal systems, often there's a discussion around freedom of association and freedom of speech. So one of the interesting areas about Rwanda is that judges, prosecutors, police, military service members, and also intelligence agents cannot have political affiliations. And so that's interesting, and it prevents conflicts of interest to a degree. Then there is freedom of speech, which is protected under the Constitution, as it's been lately updated, but that's been since pretty much the Genesis. There have been some instances of political protests around the protection of free speech, but that is outside of the scope of this lesson. Then there are also limitations on freedom of speech around organized violence, ideology, and divisionism. And if you study a bit of the history of Rwanda, you can probably understand the cultural and historical context there. All right, now let's go to freedom of movement of people and goods. So in Rwanda, there's freedom of movement in and out of the country. Of course, Rwanda also, when we move into goods, is a member of the East African Community, which includes Burundi, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, South Sudan, and Congo. So there are 0% tariffs on raw minerals, resources, and capital goods. Rwanda is also a member of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, or AFCTA, and it ratified that in 2018. This is Africa's EU, if you will, And as the EU started as a coal and steel trade union between countries and then evolved into various other organizations that eventually became the European Union. So we have the Africa Union, and we have this free trade agreement that is being ratified across Africa. And there are new things like, for example, just a few days ago, it was announced by the president that there is now no fee for entry for any citizen of an African nation who is coming into Rwanda. So things like this are happening. Rwanda is at the forefront of those things. And that goes back to the international treaties that we talked about in law. Rwanda is known for prioritizing its relationship with other nations, and that makes sense as a smaller country on the African continent. And it's also been one of the reasons for Rwanda's economic and social success over the past few decades. Now, and it's also a member of the dispute settlement body within the African Union. And this is an arbitration body that really helps with international disputes between African nations. But for specific tariffs, they're updated on a regular basis. So to keep up to date with that, there's the Rwanda Revenue Authority, which oversees the tariffs, taxes, etc. Now on to law enforcement and criminal law. So something interesting and highlighted here is that the military and police forces can sometimes work hand in hand. The Rwanda National Police is the primary police force in Rwanda. So it's a national police force. If you live in the US, you are used to having a local, maybe city, county police force, maybe a state level police force after that, and then there's that. But the Rwanda Defense Force can assist and does assist with training, as well as assist when there's a need. The RDF, as it's known, is also one of the largest military forces that partners with the UN on peacekeeping missions. So it plays a significant overseas role in policing disputes and issues across the African continent, as well as playing a role domestically in ensuring stability. And then there's due process and appeals. So there's due process in Rwanda. Everyone has the right to legal representation if they are detained, and all defendants can file for an appeal of primary court decisions. And that's both for civil and criminal cases. And additionally, one important fact is that in primary courts, there really isn't a jury of lay people, but a responsible judge who weighs the facts. And again, the judges are not allowed, and this would make sense in light of the other areas that we previously discussed, that the judges cannot be a member of a political party or have affiliation. So then there's detainment. So if someone is detained in Rwanda, they can be detained up to 5 days before a trial, but then the prosecutor can actually extend that for another 5 days. So as opposed to places like the US, where I think it's a 24-hour detainment or 48-hour, something like that, on extenuating circumstances, in Rwanda, it can be up to 10 days. But if you're a foreigner, because Rwanda is a signatory of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, the consulate of your country, if it's present in Rwanda, will be contacted, and there will be a consultation there without delay per the Vienna Convention. All right, now on to civil law. We'll focus on contracts, corporate, and property law. And so to go straight into property law, there is a very strong protection for property rights. Foreigners, when they purchase property, typically are given a 49-year leasehold, while locals receive a 99-year leasehold. And this is mostly for undeveloped land that's purchased. Recently, there was a ministerial order. So I mentioned that we were going to talk about ministerial orders. And so they have affirmed that there can be a freehold or full ownership in the traditional sense, and that if someone applies for this freehold and they actually have a leasehold, then if they can demonstrate a master plan for an infrastructure project, that can be obtained. So we're actually working on some of that right now, and in future videos we'll talk a little bit more about that process and what it looks like. Moving over, there is contract law. And so land sales, transfers, they require written agreements. Oral agreements can be, like in many places, if there's evidence, considered contract. And again, the primary source of contract interpretation is from a statutory perspective versus a case law perspective. However, of course, this is changing a bit. Moving on to corporate law, the primary regulator here is RICA, which is the Rwanda Inspectorate Competition and Consumer Protection Authority. And I have mentioned here, right there below on the bottom, under corporate law and antitrust, there's a law that defines what consumer protections are and also what constitutes fair pricing, which you can take a look at, and the materials included, as well as it has information on mergers and antitrust, etc. Moving on, of course, you can learn a lot about a legal system by looking at Supreme Court decisions. So here are three that I thought would be interesting. So there are two on the left that are civil law cases, and then one on the right that is a criminal case. So let's start with Muhutukazi versus Megawa 2013. This was a labor dispute, unfair dismissal. And to oversimplify this, there essentially was an employee who was accused of stealing something from their employer. They were fired for it. The employee said they were wrongfully terminated and that they should get their annual pay as well as be compensated for other damages. And so this made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically ruled that the employer had grounds for the termination based on the proceedings in lower courts. Additionally, both sides wanted to be compensated, but the Supreme Court basically said that neither side was going to have their legal fees compensated for, and that other courts would have to determine other areas around it. So it's an interesting case to examine. But one of the interesting facts about this case was that there was a labor union / labor lower authority agreement that was allegedly reached, but the Supreme Court allowed new evidence around that. So even though there was an agreement or a settlement, it was later allowed that new evidence. And so this Supreme Court decision basically found that if there has been a settled issue in a lower court or something of that nature, or agreement with a labor union or something like that, or with regards to labor law, that those things are not necessarily final. So that's interesting. Then there is the next case is Mushinzimana versus Rwanda, and this one is interesting because it involved a husband and a wife, whereby the wife sold a property without her husband's consent. So she entered into a contract as the spouse of her husband, giving her the right to sell the property. However, the husband didn't want to sell the property and said that the land rights that were transferred to the buyer were invalid. The court originally held that the primary court found that the transfer was legal and the wife had the right to sell. The appellate court found that the husband wasn't aware of the sale, and therefore the land purchase was canceled. So that's really interesting. And so if you look into that case, there's some interesting things there for discussion. But at the end of the day, it was then taken to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court basically said that if a dispute is under 20 million Rwandan francs, which is about $20,000, which the house at the time was sold for about 4,500, I believe, Rwandan francs. And so that case could not be heard, even though later the house was valued at the time at 20,000 Rwandan francs or greater than the threshold. The Supreme Court ruled that it depends on the time of the original dispute of value. So if you have a value of something that's $10,000 today, but the value goes up to $1 million tomorrow, by the time it reaches Supreme Court, then it still will be thrown out and the original decision of the lower appellate court will be held. So that was interesting. The interesting thing is there's quite a few layers to what these findings have. And then there was one temporary insanity, mental insanity case where someone committed a homicide, killed someone here in prosecution versus Manyambibi. And essentially, it was found that the person who committed the crime had visited their psychiatrist and had been under mental distress. And it was an accident that the person died. And so it found that because he was under mental distress and there was a record of that, that he would not be found liable for the death. So that's a case also potentially worth taking a look at. And I've selected these cases because they're some of the more recent interesting Supreme Court decisions that kind of, I think, shed a little bit of light on how the legal system works in practice. So in summary, Rwanda's legal system is transitioning from a civil/customary law legal system, or a civil and customary legal system, to a common law system. This transition has been happening over several years and is set to continue. Additionally, in implementation, at the very least, Rwanda most certainly is a modern legal system. And with regards to property rights, they are greatly protected with the new expedited system, given that ministerial order that we went over. And that's both for local and foreign entities regarding freehold ownership. Additionally, Rwanda maintains transparent online access to the laws, cases, and findings, and that's actually both for the judiciary and the legislative branch, as well as the executive branch. And so that is a quick overview. Thanks for watching.